You are listening to Bedtime Dreamy Tales. Share and subscribe our channel. Story title: The Juniper Tree. Once upon a time, in a bustling town by the sea, there lived a merchant named Klaus. He was a kind man, blessed with two adorable children, a boy named Hans and a girl named Greta. Klaus had worked hard to build his fortune, and he owned two grand ships filled with precious goods. He dreamed of the wealth these ships would bring when they returned from their voyage. However, fate had other plans. A terrible storm struck the sea, and news reached Klaus that his ships had sunk to the bottom, taking all his wealth with them. Klaus was devastated. All he had left was a small field outside the town. In his grief, Klaus wandered to this field, hoping to find solace. As he walked, he was approached by a peculiar sight: a little black mannequin standing by his side. The mannequin asked why Klaus was so sad and offered to help. Klaus, desperate and feeling he had nothing to lose, shared his woes. The mannequin, with a mischievous glint in his eye, made Klaus an offer. "If you promise to give me the first thing that rubs against your leg when you return home, I will make you as rich as you were before," he said. Klaus thought of his faithful dog and, without hesitation, agreed to the mannequin's terms. He sealed the promise with his signature, thinking he had nothing to fear. Little did he realize that it was not his dog, but his young son Hans, who would toddle up to greet him first. Klaus's heart sank when Hans clung to his leg upon his return home, realizing the grave mistake he had made. Yet, days passed, and Klaus found his chest filled with gold. He became a wealthy merchant once more, but the shadow of his promise loomed over him. As the years passed, Hans grew into a tall, clever young man, and the family lived in comfort and prosperity. However, as the 12th year approached, Klaus grew more anxious, unable to hide his distress. Hans noticed his father's unease and insisted on knowing the cause. With a heavy heart, Klaus revealed the bargain he had made with the Black Dwarf. Hans, brave and determined, assured his father that all would be well. The day finally came, and father and son went to the field where the promise had been made. Hans, fortified by the priest's blessing, drew a protective circle around them. The Black Dwarf appeared, demanding his due. Hans confronted the dwarf, insisting he had tricked his father. After a long debate, a compromise was reached. Hans would sit in a small boat on a flowing river, and Klaus would push it off, leaving his fate to the waters. With a final farewell, Hans climbed into the boat, and Klaus, with tears in his eyes, pushed it off. The boat capsized, and Klaus believed his son lost. In truth, the boat floated away, and Hans soon found himself on an unfamiliar shore, facing a magnificent castle. Hans ventured into the castle, finding it eerily empty until he reached the last room, where a snake lay coiled. To his surprise, the snake spoke, revealing she was an enchanted maiden named Isabella. She had been waiting for 12 years for her deliverer to arrive and break the spell that had bewitched the castle. Isabella explained that Hans had to endure 3 nights of torment by black men covered in chains. He must not speak a word, no matter how much they tormented him. If he endured, she would be free, and Hans would be brought back to life by the water of life she possessed. Hans agreed, and each night the tormentors came. They beat, stabbed, and tormented him, but Hans remained silent. On the 3rd night, the snake transformed into the beautiful Princess Isabella, who revived Hans with the water of life. The castle was filled with joy as Isabella's curse was lifted. They married and ruled the kingdom, which became known as the Golden Mountain. Years passed, and Hans and Isabella had a son named Leo. Their life was idyllic, but Hans's heart longed to see his father. Isabella, fearing trouble, reluctantly gave Hans a magical ring that could transport him anywhere. She made him promise not to use it to bring her and Leo to his father's town. Hans agreed and set off to visit his parents. Hans found himself outside his hometown and, dressed as a shepherd, approached his father's house. His parents, unable to recognize him, treated him kindly but did not believe his story until he showed the raspberry mark under his right arm. Reunited, Hans told them of his new life as king of the Golden Mountain. His father, skeptical, taunted him for his shabby appearance. Angered, Hans broke his promise and used the ring to bring Isabella and Leo to him. Isabella was furious and heartbroken, but she hid her feelings and pretended to forgive Hans. Later, Hans took her to the stream where he had been sent away 12 years ago. Exhausted, he laid his head on her lap and fell asleep. Seizing the moment, Isabella took the ring from his finger, slipped away with Leo, and wished herself back to their kingdom. Hans awoke alone, realizing his mistake. Determined to reclaim his family, he set off once more. He encountered 3 giants arguing over their inheritance: a magical sword, an invisibility cloak, and boots that transported the wearer anywhere. Using his wits, Hans tricked the giants into giving him all 3 items. Hans wished himself back to the Golden Mountain. There, he discovered Isabella was being forced into a new marriage. Enraged, Hans used the invisibility cloak to enter the palace. He revealed himself at the wedding feast, causing chaos. When challenged, he used the magical sword to defeat his enemies, declaring himself the true king of the Golden Mountain. With order restored, Hans and Isabella reconciled. She realized his actions, though thoughtless, were driven by love. They ruled together wisely and happily, ensuring their son Leo would inherit a kingdom united and at peace. And so the story of Hans, the king of the Golden Mountain, became a legend told for generations, reminding all of the power of courage, cleverness, and true love. If you like this story, please give this video a like. For more stories, go to bedtimedreamytales.com. See you in the next story.